In this video, you will learn how to adjust bubbles per second of CO2 and how much to inject in your aquarium, as well as measure how much CO2 is in your aquarium. Check it out. Welcome to another video, and if you want to excel your knowledge in aquariums, hit that subscribe button as well as that notification icon so you don't miss any more videos. Now, I've been getting this question a lot, and a lot of people who first begin using pressurized CO2 has a little trouble understanding this concept, and I understand it. Now, I mentioned this in the CO2 series guide that I have, but let's go ahead and get more into it, and we'll understand how many bubbles per second you will need to inject CO2 in your tank, as well as how to measure CO2 in your tank. Now, first off, understanding bubbles per second and how much to put in your tank, that is a loaded question, because a lot of people expect me to just give them a certain amount of bubbles to put in their tank, and it just doesn't work that way, only because there's a lot of variables to understand how much CO2 to inject in your tank and how much CO2 your tank can actually hold, and that's all dependent on thousands of variables. For example, the pressure in your tank, how much lighting you have, your plant load, etc., etc. So there's a lot that goes into it, so I can't give you a direct number, even if you just give me a whole rundown of what you have set up on your tank. Now, as always, I always suggest starting with 1 bubbles per second and adjust up or down from there, depending on how well your plants are doing and depending on how much CO2 is in your tank. Now, let's go over this really quick. A lot of people don't understand what bubbles per second is when they get into pressurized CO2. It basically goes like this. You take a look at your bubble counter, and then you just count the bubbles of how many bubbles go up from the bottom to the top per second. So if it's 1 bubble per second, you'll have the bubble go from the bottom to the top in 1 second. If it's 2 bubbles per second, it'll be 2 bubbles that'll go from the bottom to the top in 1 second. So on and so on and so on. As I mentioned before, the amount of bubbles per second you're going to be putting in your tank really depends on a lot of variables. One of them really is how well you're diffusing CO2 in your tank, because that's one of the most important things that you actually have to watch out for. And if you don't understand that, check out this video here on CO2 diffusion that I did in the CO2 series. So how many bubbles per second of CO2 do you need to inject in your tank? There's actually 3 ways to figure that out, and we'll go over that right now. Now, the first way to do it is actually a true and tried method, which is watch, wait, and see. Now, this might be a little harder for people that just get into using CO2, using pressurized CO2. But I guarantee you, once you get it down, that's pretty much a method that you're going to go with. This is basically all based on observation. So check it out, this is how it works. So you set up your tank, set up your CO2 system, you get it going, and you start pumping 1 bubble per second. So you wait a week or 2 and then just see how well your plants are doing. And of course, make sure that your fish aren't gasping for air. At this point, you could actually determine and say, well, maybe I could go ahead and go with 2 bubbles per second and then see how well it does. You wait another week or 2 and then just see how well it does. And then you'll get the hang of it after a while, and you'll understand how much CO2 you can put in your tank and get that massive amount of plant growth, as well as not kill everything in your tank, namely your fish. Now, second way of doing it is actually using a drop checker. Drop checkers are great, they do work, but unfortunately they're not very accurate because they're giving you a reading based on an hour or 2 ago of what the state of your tank is, or rather how much CO2 is in your tank. Now, you probably see this all over YouTube. You see these little contraptions, they're glass and they have a colored liquid in it. It actually looks really, really cool. And there's actually different types of drop checkers out there, the different makes and models and stuff like that. Whichever way you go with, I only suggest using this as an indicator, or if you just want to put it in your tank to just look cool. Now, drop checker works this way. You take the drop checker, and you actually put water in. Now, we don't want to use either tap water or aquarium water because there's extra minerals in there that might affect the pH readings and give you an inaccurate reading. So you want to make a solution or use a solution or buy a solution on the market. It's called DKH4, which is basically water that will measure at KH of 4. Now, after that, you put about 3 drops of the solution that either came with your drop checker or that you bought on the market, or if you already have on hand, the pH solution in your test kit. And basically, you just go ahead and put the drop checker in your tank and just let it be. And you basically just look at the color. If it's blue, that means it's measuring either no CO2 or low CO2 in your tank. If it's green or lime green, that's about the area that you actually want to be safe with the level of CO2 in your tank. And of course, if it turns yellow, that means you're on the high side of stuff and you better keep an eye on your fish. Now, the third way of doing this is probably the more accurate way of doing it and the less expensive way of doing it without going out and buying equipment to measure CO2 in your tank. There is equipment out there that does measure CO2, but that's kind of out of the price range, kind of out of the range of what we're talking about in this video. Now, the first thing you need is some way to measure your pH, either with a pH test kit or a pH probe or a pH tester, whatever it is. You should already have one. If you don't, then I don't know what's wrong with you. The second thing you need is a KH test kit, and then you're going to measure your KH in your tank. First, get a reading of the KH in your tank. That's it. Very simple. Once you have that, write it down. Then you need to take a pH reading. You take a pH reading before the lights and CO2 goes on. Write that down. Then after a couple hours, when your CO2 and light has been on your tank during the prime time of your tank where everything's growing and being active and stuff, do another pH reading. Write that down. Now, the most optimal CO2 you want in your tank is about 30 to 40 ppms. Now, this could change and vary depending on how your tank's set up and how many plants you have growing there. You might be able to pump more CO2 based on your plant load. And finally, take a chart that you will find on the internet. You can search it. It's called Co2 Chart, but I suggest using this chart I have up on the screen. This is what I got from Tom Barr's forums, and this will do you well. So what you do is take your KH readings and cross-check it with your pH reading that you measured before the lights and CO2 came on. So let's just say your pH is 7.2, your KH is 4. So you do a cross-check on that chart. Now what you need to do is find out how many pH drops you need to get to that target level, which say in this case 30 ppms. Let's just make it simple. Now, as according to this chart, you need that pH reading to say 6.6 after the lights and CO2 has come on after a while. That was the second pH reading that I mentioned. Now, let's just say your readings are off the chart. Your pH is like 5.5 or your KH readings are like less than 1 or 0. If that's the case, then you just kind of average it out based on the higher readings on the chart itself. And you can kind of figure out how much pH drop you need of injecting CO2 in your tank to get to by just looking at the higher numbers. Now, there's a couple things you know about this method and about this chart. Basically, 30 ppms is in the red boxes, which says it's a danger zone. It's okay to go in the danger zone. A couple boxes up, it's not going to harm anything. It's just going to keep that CO2 levels that you need in your tank. However, you could even go up more, but that's again based on how well you have your tank set up, how well your O2 and CO2 equilibriums is in your tank. If you don't understand that, check out this video where I do explain that. Now, for KH readings in your water, the water you're using, the source water you're using, it shouldn't fluctuate that much. Mainly, I only test my KH in my tank probably every month or if something goes wacky, okay? So it does change, but not that drastically unless they do something really weird to the city water if you're using tap water. But you could be safe by just testing it maybe once a month just to make sure that the KH is still either at 3 or 4 or whatever you have initially measured it at. And of course, if you're using RO water, it's going to be much easier because you already know how to get to a certain KH level, GH level, whatever, based on how much you measured on how to remineralize that water. Now, yes, the last method was a little complicated to explain, but it's really quite easy once you get it down. Now, once you get it down, all three methods here, you're probably going to use and mesh up. I still have drop checkers in my tank. Even though I don't really use them, I do just spot check my tank using a drop checker. Otherwise, I already know my KH in my tank. I know it's relatively going to be the same number for a while, so I keep it at that, and all I have is my pH probe measuring the pH in the tank, and I could just eye that while it's going. And of course, using method one of observation of how well my plants are doing. So you're going to mix up all these methods when you get more experience in doing planted tanks, and it's going to be very easy to adjust your bubbles per second to get those CO2 levels to the perfect medium that will make your tanks bloom. It's really that easy, guys, and I know you can get it with a little patience, a little more experience. Remember, guys, hit that like button if you like this video. Share it where you can. If you haven't already, subscribe to my channel to let me know that making these videos is actually well worth it. Love you guys, and remember, stay wet with your tanks. Bye.